Hey guys, and welcome to the first video on Chapter 9 for Classical India. Now, before I get into talking about any of the people and empires and events of that era, I first wanted to make kind of like a primer video for religion of India. Now, the first religion that I'm going to be talking about is one that you guys have probably never heard of, even though it's still around to this day, and that's Jainism. Jainism is an old religion. It traces its roots back to the 6th century BCE. And this guy, Vardhamana Mahavira, he did not actually start it, but under his leadership and tutelage, the movement really took off. And here you see a shrine, a statue dedicated to him. A couple things of note here. One, you notice his leg positioning. They had to be very careful in artistic depictions of him because he was an ascetic. I'll talk more about that in a second, but asceticism, he gave up all of his worldly possessions, including clothes. So dude was naked all the time, so you had to be careful about how you depicted him. And also here, you notice these symbols probably look familiar. And in the official logo, if you will, of Jainism, you see it much more clearly here, the swastika. The swastika of Jainism and Hinduism has absolutely nothing to do with the usage that we associate with it in the modern world because of Hitler and the Nazis. Right? It was a symbol of peace. It was a symbol of rebirth. And it's very, very common that you'll see that associated with Jainism and also with Hinduism as well. So if you see that, if you're seeing something about India and you see swastikas there, chances are it has absolutely nothing to do with Hitler and the Nazis. Okay, asceticism. I mentioned that before. Asceticism is giving up of all worldly possessions. And sometimes that can be taken to a very extreme. You look at this statue here. This is a statue of the Buddha. The Buddha, during his early days of seeking out, kind of figuring out suffering, turned to asceticism. And you notice kind of the very, very gaunt and emaciated, kind of very like sickly, almost death-like kind of skinniness to him. That's because if you take it to an extreme, you're giving up not only material possessions, but you're giving up food, you're giving up clothes, you're giving up shelter. So that's when it's taken to an extreme. Not everybody takes it to that much, but that is what it's about. Okay. Jains also believe in this notion called ahimsa. Ahimsa is nonviolence, and sometimes that can be taken to an extreme as well. You have a photograph of Jain women, and you notice that they have mouth coverings, and they also have these things on their shoulders that almost look like feather dusters or mops. The mouth coverings are mostly symbolic. It's to represent that they don't want even bugs flying into their mouths. And also with the feather dusters that they'll kind of sweep the ground in front of them so they don't step on bugs. As I said, it's mostly symbolic, but it's to represent their belief that everything has a soul and that no living thing should be harmed. And along with that, that belief that everything has a soul and the equality of that soul in all living things, the caste system, let me get rid of these. That's a no-no, according to Jains. Okay, they reject it. Now, Buddhism. Buddhism, you probably know a little bit about, hopefully you remember some stuff from last year, but just so some of this may be reviewed, but going into some other stuff in more depth. It starts with this guy, Siddhartha Gautama, okay, lived a while ago, 563 to 483 BCE, and he was born into luxury. He was born a prince, and he had the good life, wanted for nothing, and he never experienced sadness or suffering a day in his life. Then one day he travels outside the palace walls, and he sees people dead and dying. He sees people starving. He sees people fighting amongst each other. He sees people in poverty, and he kind of can't wrap his head around it. He doesn't get it. He goes, why is there this suffering in the world? So he gives up his life of luxury. He leaves that life behind, including his family, and he goes off in the search of why is there suffering. And at first, this leads him to asceticism. He says, I'm going to kind of give up everything, and I'm going to just turn myself to, deprive myself of all worldly endeavors, and I'll understand suffering myself. Well, that didn't really get it. And then he turns to meditation. And after 49 days of meditating under a tree, he finally reaches enlightenment. He gets it all figured out. All right, here's a picture of him under the Bodhi tree, and he achieves the title of the Buddha, the Enlightened One. Now, what he figured out, he said, all boils down to the Four Noble Truths. He says, life has inevitable suffering. No matter what, you're going to suffer. He says, there is a cause to our suffering. According to him, this was caused by desire. He says you want things, you desire for material possessions, you desire for wealth, you desire for fame, you desire for power, whatever it is. But it's that wanting of things that causes suffering. And he says there's an end to suffering. How do you end it? You need to get rid of desire. And the end to suffering, the way to end desire, is contained in the Eightfold Path. And you got this up here. First thing you notice about it, it's a circle. There's no hierarchy to it. All of these are equal, just different spokes on a wheel. The other thing is that this is often referred to as the middle path. It's about moderation. It's about getting rid of the extremes in your life. It's about kind of finding that moderate path of the right effort, right action, right speech, so that you can reach a status of contentment and enlightenment and get rid of desire and thereby get rid of suffering. Okay. Now, same way with Jains, Buddhists reject the caste system. They said we do not believe in a spiritual hierarchy. It says that we are all spiritual equals. Likewise, with Brahmins, remember these are the guys up at the top. They were the priest caste and they were responsible for guiding people. Got no time for them either. No time for priests and rituals and so forth. Meditation is the key. Now, this appealed to a number of people. This rejection of the caste system and getting rid of the status of Brahmins, this especially appealed to lower castes. Some other things that appealed, the notion of moderation, like we talked about in the Eightfold Path, the use of vernacular. They didn't write everything in Sanskrit, which was the holy script of Hinduism, but nobody was speaking it even more, even during the Buddha's time. So they had to rely on Brahmins to translate it all. And stupas. Stupas were temples that housed relics, in some cases even bones of holy figures in Buddhism. Very similar to the way that churches and cathedrals in Christianity would do the same. And they became sites of pilgrimages for Buddhists. And it kind of gave a tangible, real life connection to their spirituality, to salvation. Okay. Now, Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism was a newer kind of movement within Buddhism that really contributed to the spread of Buddhism throughout Southeast Asia and even into the Far East as well. Now, this takes off, it develops over a long period of time, 3rd century BCE into 1st century CE. And the biggest change with Mahayana Buddhism is that now Buddha becomes a divine figure. During the early days of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama never made himself out to be a god, nor did his followers make him to be divine. That's why a lot of people classify early Buddhism as being more a philosophy than a religion. But under Mahayana Buddhism, Buddha is now revered and worshipped as being a divine figure, and so now we can fully classify it as a religion. Now, this makes it a little bit easier for people to kind of understand it. The people that weren't totally devoted to their lives as living as a monk or something like that, it was tougher for them to wrap their head around this. Now they figure, well, I can worship the Buddha, and that allows me a path to salvation. Makes it a little simpler for them. You also have these guys called the Bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas were kind of like saints in a way. They were individuals who had achieved nirvana, but stayed behind, didn't, pass on to that ultimate state of enlightenment. They stayed here on earth to help out the rest of us, to help us get there. And lastly, monasteries started accepting gifts. This one in particular allowed lay people, right? It allowed people that did not just, kind of devote their lives completely to Buddhism, to feel that there was another path of salvation. That if they gave to the monasteries, if they followed the advice of the bodhisattvas, if they worship Buddha as a god, they didn't have to give up their past lives the way the Buddha did and go live a life of total seclusion. Right? So Mahayana Buddhism was a big reason for the spread of Buddhism, and it's also to this day the largest sect of Buddhism. Now, Hinduism, another very old religion, very complex religion. Some concepts with it. Okay, so I'll just go through some terms here. One is Brahman. Brahman is this kind of universal spirit, this idea that, the universe is one large spirit, but that it's too big for us as mortals to understand. So that's why we need to break them down into different gods, such as Shiva and Vishnu and Krishna and so forth. Samsara is just a fancy term for reincarnation, right? This cycle of death, birth, and rebirth and so forth. All right, we talk, that's big within the caste system. Karma. Karma we think of as, what goes around comes around. And what's important to remember, though, and that in Hinduism, it's what comes around in the next life. Karma is the accumulation of your actions, either good or bad, that would impact how you are reincarnated. Right? Good karma equals you move up in the caste system in the next life. Bad karma, you move down. Now, with Hinduism, they kind of break it down to these four main goals. The first one is dharma. This is your obligation, right? This is your path, if you will, what you're supposed to do, and especially within your caste. Artha is the seeking of wealth, the seeking of material goods. That was not something that was necessarily frowned upon. Asceticism says to give up everything. Well, Hinduism isn't about that necessarily. He says that, you can become wealthy. Remember, there's a hierarchy within Hinduism. So having more than others was not necessarily going to be an evil thing. But likewise, kama, which was more about physical pleasure and so forth, sexual pleasure. It wasn't something that was frowned upon the way that other religions did. So that was a goal. And all of these, when you add them up, lead to moksha. Moksha is this kind of ultimate enlightenment, similar to nirvana in Buddhism, but moksha is kind of becoming one with the universe, becoming one with Brahman. All right, Hindu ethics. An awful lot of what we know about Hindu ethics come from these epic poems from the Vedic age, which originally weren't even written down, because the early Aryans didn't have a writing system. They were passed down orally. But one of the more famous ones is the Mahabharata. Okay, this is an epic poem, and there's kind of a sub-poem within it called the Bhagavad Gita. Now, the Bhagavad Gita, it's a tale of, this prince. The whole thing, the Mahabharata, was a tale of a civil war between families. And this prince here, Jarmusch, he, is very hesitant to go into battle because he's going into battle against his family members, and he questions himself. And his charioteer, this dude here, who is a earthly avatar for the god Krishna, even though Jarmusch doesn't know it at the time, gives him a bit of a pep talk and gives him a lesson on responsibility. And he says, you are a kshatriya, you're a warrior, and it is your responsibility to go into battle. He says that it reinforces the notion of caste responsibility. And also that by worshiping the gods, it can bring you peace and contentment. So it stresses duty. It also stresses you to be involved. It says be involved as opposed to detached. So, this idea that salvation can be offered, to lower caste through service as well, that starts to take off. Now, Hindu popularity, as I said, offered salvation through service. It begins to replace Buddhism, especially in the northern regions. Buddhism would eventually become less and less popular throughout India. And also with the support of Gupta rulers, with the Gupta Empire really they support it. Becomes almost like a state religion at that point. Okay, so that was just a kind of a quick overview of some of the major religions. And for the next video, we will get into talking about the dynasties and all that fun stuff.